Ministers, dear delegates, we will now begin our third plenary session of the 22nd IISS Shangri-La dialogue. In this session, we will discuss the changing security landscape across the region and the challenges in managing proliferation risks in the Asia-Pacific. Countries in the region are, of course, modernizing and strengthening their national defense capabilities, and against that context, we want to explore ways of mitigating the risks of proliferation and the potential for confrontation. And I'm delighted to be joined here on stage by Dr. José Ramos Horta, the President of Timor-Leste, Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defense of Australia, and by Ruben Brekelmans, the Minister of Defense of the Netherlands. They will make their interventions from the podium, and we will then turn to Q&A as before. Remember, delegate badge into the microphone unit, press the button, you will join the queue. And we shall start with President Ramos Horta. And Mr. President, let me first congratulate you on the splendid news that Timor-Leste will become ASEAN's 11th member state, with full membership to be granted soon, probably later this year. Congratulations. And second, let me invite you to take the floor, Mr. President.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to join you here. Again, this is the fourth time I participate in Shangri-La Security Dialogue. The first time was 20 years ago when I was foreign minister, and now 3 times in a row as president. And I begin by thanking ASEAN leadership, ASEAN leaders, ASEAN Secretariat, and ASEAN dialogue partners for supporting Timor-Leste in our journey since 2011, a journey in preparing, in upgrading our infrastructures, our state institutions, consolidating peace, democracy in the country, fulfilling implementing the roadmap adopted by ASEAN leaders. And in Kuala Lumpur, we were welcomed unanimously by all to join, and the expectation is that in October this year, under chairmanship of Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, Malaysia, we will be joining formally as the 11th member, completing the family of ASEAN Southeast Asian countries. So, and I thank all profusely for their support over the years. And also I'm probably the only Nobel Peace Prize laureate participating in a war ministers meeting. And I say defense ministers are not necessarily war ministers, but just to emphasize the uniqueness of my participation as a Nobel laureate, I probably should feel completely alone. I first give you a bit of a picture of what Asia is. Of course, all of you know, but it's important to have these figures in mind. You know, Asia is a home to 4.83 billion people living in area 30% of the world land. But at the same time, we have 1.7 billion people who are poor, and almost 9 million people standing army, 510 billion defense budget, and of the region hosts 6 of the world's 9 nuclear-armed countries. You know, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, Russia, and the United States, the nuclear powers. And 6 in Asia. And one or two would be classified as fragile states. And just imagine nuclear weapons stored by an unstable, fragile country. I don't mention the names, obviously, but each of you can figure out which would be classified as fragile in this group. Then we have a missile development, many countries advancing their missile capabilities, hypersonic, long-range missiles, and some nations already transitioned from importers to exporters of missile technology. And in terms of the arms control framework, many in Asia-Pacific countries are not members of key arms control agreements like the Missile Technology Control Regime and the Hague Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation. And this, of course, leads to inconsistent adherence to non-proliferation norms. Erosion of global treaties. I would note that the US withdrawal from the INF treaty has removed, intentionally or not, I presume unintentionally, remove constraints on the deployment of certain missile systems in the region. Challenges in regional arms control. Efforts to establish regional arms control measures face obstacles due to, geopolitical rivalries and a lack of consensus among key players. And what are the root causes of all of this? Geopolitical tensions, rivalries between major powers, US, China, and others, security dilemmas, perceived threats from neighbors. When one neighbor advances its arms technology, it prompts others to acquire similar capabilities, of course, then leading to arms race. Technological advances, rapid technological progress has made missile and nuclear technologies more accessible, complicating non-proliferation efforts. And there are very weak enforcement mechanisms and the absence of binding regional agreements. All this contribute to erosion of arms control. Potential for solutions for consideration. We should look at the strengthening support for regional initiatives like the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network, which is a network of over 100 political, military, diplomatic, academic leaders from 18 countries across the Asia-Pacific region. Established in 2011, the organization dedicated to addressing security challenges in the region. Strengthening export control, improving national export control systems, promoting transparency, communication, establishing communication channels, and so on. Of course, needless to say, Timor-Leste is not a player in all of these problems. We just watch from the periphery with growing concern about the dismantling of post-World War II multilateral system, the dismantling of what has been painstakingly built over many generations of people, of leaders across the world to ensure that World War III does not happen, but also to ensure that we combine our resources to address the challenge of poverty in the world, because after all, what is the world? It is humanity. And what are the world are the 1.7 billion people living in poverty in Asia, two-thirds of it in Asia. And what is humanity if not we prevent conflict? And I end by saying You know, I had a 40-minute discussion with Papa Francisco in January last year, and I told Papa Francisco, very frankly, I said, Your Holiness, I'm disillusioned with the world leadership. We talk all the time about conflict prevention. We fail to prevent Ukraine from happening. We talk all the time about prevention. We fail to prevent Gaza from exploding, and so many other situations. And the Pope looked at me, he was surprised, concerned, and he answered in Spanish. We spoke in Spanish, pero tenemos que continuar a luchar por la paz. We must continue to work for peace. But the reality is that as we gather here, as we meet here, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, are deprived of food, basic medical care, clean water, access to education. It seems like there is a regression on the implementation of the climate change agreements that were already modest, and yet we do not see much happening, particularly in richer countries, working with the poorer countries on climate change issues like adaptation, mitigation, and so on. And partly because, understandably so, global economic crisis, deficits that limit the capacity even of the rich countries to respond to this greater humanitarian challenge. And in the midst of all of this, on one industry that never had problems, and that is the army industry. When there are wars, armed industry annual board report show increase in profit. That's the only one. So anyway, I end here my comments. I hope I did in 5 minutes or less. Thank you. God bless you all.
Mr. President, thank you very much. As you said, you added an interesting perspective on these issues that, starting with your point about the inconsistent application of norms and the obstacles that stand in the way of perhaps progress around arms control questions. But it is interesting that you also offered a few thoughts on where one might start to begin to move this conversation along. So thank you very much for that, and I'm sure we will want to pick up on this. May I now invite Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister from Australia to take the floor. Richard.
Well, could I thank you, Bastian, and IISS, and indeed the government of Singapore for holding yet another remarkable Shangri-La dialogue. Can I also acknowledge my fellow panellists, Jose and Ruben. I'm delighted to be back here at the Shangri-La dialogue, my fourth as Australia's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence. And it really is a credit to the government of Singapore and the IISS that the dialogue has become the indispensable forum to talk about Indo-Pacific security. Our region has become the world's most consequential strategic arena. And while war and disorder rages in European and Middle Eastern theatres, we cannot be complacent here. Resurgent geopolitical tensions mean the Indo-Pacific is not only the venue for the world's largest conventional military and nuclear rearmament, it has also become ground zero in the race for technological supremacy. So today's session on arms control and proliferation, a set of issues that sit at the intersection of military capability and technology is particularly apt. We owe the arms control regime we know today, this architecture of restraint, to the Cold War, when the fateful emergence of nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technologies drove an urgent global consensus in the need to de-risk US-Soviet competition. And it created the platform for one of the great achievements of multilateralism, the landmark Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. This treaty not only became the indispensable framework to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, it and subsequent agreements formed the cornerstone of global non-proliferation efforts, first nuclear, then biological, and then chemical. The NPT has made the world safer. It remains as relevant today and is as important as ever. And it is essential that all of us remain committed to it. For our part, Australia conforming to the NPT is a fundamental tenet of our strategic and foreign policy. Australia acquiring a nuclear-powered submarine capability under the banner of AUKUS is essential to our national security and will play a part in providing geostrategic balance in the Indo-Pacific. In moving down this path, at all times Australia will comply with the NPT, which is why we are pursuing the highest safeguard standards through an arrangement with the IAEA under Article 14 of Australia's Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. Also emerging from the Cold War was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Missile Technology Control Regime. These were not acts of altruism, but pragmatic responses to the existential dangers of unbridled proliferation. These arrangements, while imperfect, provided crucial stability in an era where the risk of miscalculation could have been catastrophic. When the Cold War ended 35 years ago, many assumed the need for strategic control, arms control ended there too. And it is a measure of our times that this assumption has been proved to be so spectacularly inaccurate. The world now faces new and increasingly complex strategic challenges, ever more uncertain and unpredictable. The global architecture that provided a foundation for strategic deterrence and assurance has fallen into dangerous decline. The INF collapsed in 2019, leaving non-strategic nuclear weapons unchecked by a formal agreement. Russia suspended its participation in the last remaining binding bilateral arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, New START, in 2023, with the treaty itself set to expire in February of next year. And this leaves no legally binding limits on the strategic nuclear arsenals of the two largest nuclear powers for the first time since 1972. In a more interconnected world, bilateral controls are insufficient. More countries are invested in shaping the geostrategic environment. China's decision to pursue rapid nuclear modernisation and expansion, which aims in part to reach parity with or surpass the United States, is another reason the future of strategic arms control must be revitalised. And that is a difficult and a daunting project. Today's world demands we move beyond the simple focus on numbers and types of warheads and delivery systems. New technologies like cyber, the weaponisation of space, and the ability to integrate nuclear weapons with autonomous systems means traditional arms control frameworks are being surpassed without any established method of control to supplement them. And we also have to counter the grim, potentially imminent possibility of another wave of global nuclear proliferation as states seek security in a new age of imperial ambition. In a profound abrogation of its responsibilities as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, Russia has threatened to use nuclear weapons in its war of conquest in Eastern Europe. Not only does this work against states disarming their own nuclear arsenals, as Ukraine responsibly did back in 1994, the war is prompting some frontier states most exposed to Russian aggression to consider their options. And this has dire consequences for our region too. Russia has agreed a strategic partnership with North Korea to access munitions and troops Moscow needs to continue its war. The probability that Russia is transferring nuclear weapons technology in payment for Pyongyang's support places intolerable pressure on both South Korea and Japan. And at the same time, Iran's nuclear program and its belligerence to its neighbours is also destabilising. Now, all these actions risk sparking new proliferation cycles in both Europe and Asia. Jeopardising US extended nuclear deterrence arrangements, a critical, if undersung, asset in the fight against nuclear proliferation. In short, arms control today is vastly more complicated and the risks are growing. The landmark treaties that defined the era of arms control, including the NPT, are just as relevant today as they were decades ago, and as imperfect as they are. Strengthening transparency, compliance, and risk reduction is key to making them work today. As Australia's National Defence Strategy argued last year, we must also invest in the arduous task of building a new architecture of restraint that addresses the realities of today's geopolitical environment and the unique characteristics of new technologies before they are fully integrated into military arsenals. The arms control regime that we knew was a foundational component of an oft-maligned concept, the international rules-based order. Arms control must be seen as a necessary but not sufficient feature of a broader strategic order that we must build anew in order to find as much by rules and norms as it is by power. Any such durable Indo-Pacific order must be characterised by a balance of power that helps manage strategic competition. In geopolitics, imbalance is provocative. It alters the calculus around the risks of military force and invites the kind of deterrence failure we saw in Europe 3 years ago. China is embarked on the largest conventional military build-up since the end of World War II. And it's doing so without providing any strategic transparency or reassurance. And this remains a defining feature of the strategic complexity that the Indo-Pacific and the world faces today. The commitment underscored by US Secretary of Defence Hegseth today that the Indo-Pacific is the United States' strategic priority is deeply welcome. The reality is that there is no effective balance of power in this region absent the United States. But we cannot leave it to the United States alone. Other countries must contribute to this balance as well, and that includes Australia. Through the largest peacetime increase in defence spending since the end of the Second World War, Australia is investing in a generational transformation of the ADF to ensure we are not only in a position to deter force projection against us, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, to contribute to an effective regional balance where no state concludes that force is a viable way to achieve strategic goals. Our government is making a generational investment into defence, and we will continue to make further funding decisions based on the assets and capabilities we need to play our part and to meet the strategic moment. A durable order in the Indo-Pacific must also maintain incentives to keep the peace. While a balance of power seeks to ensure that states accept the risks of territorial conquest are too great, they must also be convinced that the peace is too valuable. And in practice, this means both preserving and building the interdependencies among states in trade, investment, ideas, and people. De-risking supply chains is an unfortunate but necessary response to intensifying strategic competition. But letting this tip over into wholesale decoupling would be a grave mistake. Dividing the Indo-Pacific into geostrategic and geoeconomic blocks would not only make us all poorer, it would make us more vulnerable to conflict. If opportunities are removed to become more prosperous through trade and investment between states, key incentives are also removed to keep the peace. Interdependence is no panacea, but nor is securitization, which imposes only binary options and counterintuitively undermines deterrence. Liberal trade matters. Trade has been the lifeblood of the Asian region, and the shock and disruption to trade from high tariffs has been costly and destabilising. Australia will always ensure due attention is paid to the requirements of security, and likewise we will continue to advocate for closer regional trade and investment integration, for the free flow of people and ideas, and for investing in the region's unique multilateral structures that support all of this, above all ASEAN and the Pacific Island Forum. Now, when I attended the dialogue last year, I was really struck by President Prabowo's speech in which he said the nations of the world both depended on and demanded the wisdom and statesmanship of great powers. No fact illustrates President Prabowo's point more acutely than the re-emergence of strategic nuclear competition and the technological tools that make this competition even more dangerous. A stable and durable regional order, inclusive of urgent arms control requirements, won't be possible unless all countries pursue their strategic aims in a manner that respects the sovereign rights of others, the obligations imposed by international law, and the global rules-based order. And the effectiveness of such arms restraints will ultimately be the tests of our times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defence. I think the consequences you outlined about what really has been a trend line of that decline of architecture of restraint for what is a consequential region of the world, I think that's a really very important point. And I think the points you made about the new proliferation cycles that might be destabilizing, that might pose problems for deterrence, and that might need to be integrated into thinking around durable peace, durable deterrence, and durable balance are all very important. Ruben Brekelmans, if I may ask you, please, to take the floor and offer your remarks.
Excellencies and colleagues, distinguished guests, on behalf of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, let me begin with a heartfelt thank you to our hosts, the IISS and the Government of Singapore. In a time of great uncertainty, your commitment to dialogue and diplomacy lights the path forward. It's a privilege to be here in the heart of the Indo-Pacific, one of the world's most strategically vital regions. Though the Netherlands may be geographically distant, we are deeply connected to this region. What happens here reverberates across the globe, because in today's world, global security is inextricably linked. Whether we are confronting the threat of nuclear proliferation, shaping rules around AI, or standing up for key principles such as the freedom of navigation, we must meet these challenges together. Allow me to take you back briefly to a powerful moment in history. The year was 1994. The Cold War had ended, and the world dared to believe that peace was there to stay. In that moment of hope, the world came together to make a promise to a young and independent Ukraine. Through the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It did so not out of weakness, but out of conviction. Conviction that international agreements meant something, that global powers would stand by their word, that sovereignty, once guaranteed, was not negotiable. Among the signatories of the Budapest Memorandum was the Russian Federation. And yet, over 3 years ago, that same Russia trampled all over the very pledge it had once signed. It invaded Ukraine on a large scale. It occupied its land. It shattered its borders and shelled its cities. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not just a war of aggression. It's a betrayal of principle, of trust. A betrayal of the fundamental idea that disarmament, diplomacy, and dialogue are safer than arms races and war. And what message does that send to the world? It tells others, do not disarm, do not trust treaties, do not rely on promises. It's a message we cannot afford to accept. Because the moment we accept that, we invite the return of fear. We will open the door to arms races, to nuclear brinkmanship, and to the dangerous principle that might makes right. And we are seeing this happen, also here in the Indo-Pacific. North Korea continues to expand its nuclear arsenal in defiance of international law. The lack of transparency around China's nuclear expansion adds to the risk. And given this proliferation, the escalation of territorial disputes, imperial ambitions, and geopolitical competition becomes more risky. These are not isolated threats. Our world is too interconnected, too interwoven for security threats to remain contained. In Ukraine, Russia is not acting alone. It is supported militarily, technologically, economically, and politically by actors from across the globe. North Korean soldiers fight alongside Russian forces in Ukraine and have delivered massive numbers of weapons and ammunition. Drones from Iran strike cities and critical Ukrainian infrastructure. Chinese economic and political support help Russia to continue its aggression. And in return, Russia is sharing knowledge and modern technology with North Korea, increasing its threat to the region. In return, Russia and its allies maintain the resources to support authoritarianism and fuel conflict also in this region. And in return, China and others feel emboldened that imperialism pays off. This war demonstrates how regional conflicts can become global challenges, demanding global responses. Beyond state actors, we also face something even more unpredictable. Technology that is evolving faster than our doctrines, rules and ethics can keep up with. AI is reshaping the battlefield. Algorithms influence when strikes take place, the way of defense, and who is making the ultimate call. The right information at the right time is vital for any modern military, but it must be guided by judgment, not just by data. AI is not inherently dangerous, but without moral boundaries, without meaningful human control, it can become a threat online, unlike anything we have seen so far. Because machines do not grieve. They do not hesitate. They do not understand the weight of a mistake. And what happens when AI misreads intent? When escalation ladders are climbed not by men, but by machines? When command systems are hacked, spoofed, or deceived? These are not hypothetical risks. These are very real. And they are compounded by cyber threats, misinformation, anti-satellite weapons. All tools that are already being used to destabilize, deceive, and divide. So we face a choice. Do we allow ambition to outpace responsibility? Or do we rise to the challenge to innovate and to regulate, to lead and to safeguard? The Netherlands is choosing the latter. That is why in 2023, we initiated the first Responsible AI in the Military Domain Summit. The first edition was organized in The Hague. We are calling for robust international agreements on the military use of AI. Also, as a proud NATO ally, the Netherlands supports the long-term aspiration of a world free of nuclear weapons on the one hand, while, for as long as nuclear weapons continue to exist, the collective deterrence posture of the alliance will remain on the other hand. We remain committed and advocate for strengthening the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It still is and can remain a strong pillar of global peace. We fully support the IAEA's additional protocol, and we urge all signatories to do the same. And we call on all nuclear-armed states to embrace greater transparency. The Netherlands commends the United States, the United Kingdom, and France for their willingness to share basic information about their arsenals. And we urge Russia and China to do the same. Because transparency is not just a diplomatic gesture. It is a cornerstone of security. Secrecy breeds fear. Opacity fuels worst-case thinking. And uncertainty accelerates the risks of arms competition. Only through openness, accountability, and mutual understanding can we restore trust. And by trust-building measures, prevent further escalation. Also, the commitment in Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to pursue disarmament in good faith is not just aspirational language. It's a binding legal obligation that demands concrete action, measurable progress, and real accountability. The Netherlands will continue to hold all nuclear-armed states accountable for meeting those obligations. And at the same time, we must intensify regional and global dialogue, strengthen crisis communication channels, rebuild confidence through cooperation, because without cooperation and without communication, there can be no trust. And without trust, there can be no security. Colleagues, in a world spinning faster and faster, in which AI is evolving overnight, in which threats are no longer confined by borders or treaties, we must stand firm. We must stand together to uphold the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to confront the nuclear threats of our time, to responsibly govern the technologies of tomorrow, and to remind the world that peace is not weakness, it's our highest calling. The Netherlands is doing its part. We are working with NATO to combat disinformation. We are supporting the peaceful use of nuclear energy under strict conditions. We are helping to enforce UN sanctions against North Korea. We are standing by Ukraine. not just in solidarity, but in defense of a world in which promises do matter. And we are contributing to peace and security in the Indo-Pacific, because your security is our security too. A unique example and proof of successful multinational security cooperation here in the region is United Nations Command, UNC, in the Republic of Korea. UNC was born out of crisis, but will soon be celebrating its 75th anniversary. The freedom our veterans fought for 75 years ago should never be taken for granted. This is why the Netherlands continues to contribute to the United Nations Command, to enhance peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is watching, the next generation is waiting, and history is being written here and now. Let us write it together. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for those remarks. And I think across the three contributions, there were a number of common themes, both of course in terms of the concerns that you expressed, but also the approaches that you advocated for, of course, including issues such as transparency and an attempt to codify some of these constraints that I think you all feel are necessary. There's probably an argument there that in the evolution, or in light of the technological evolution that was also mentioned, how one goes about codifying them is changing as well. So we might have to tackle the question of how that looks in the future. So we'll now take a group of questions, and we already have some 20 or so who are seeking the floor. So we'll take a first group of questions, and then we'll return to the panel for a round of answers, and then we'll do a second, and we'll see whether we can manage a third round as well. First, please, from Thailand and from the Young Leaders Group, Tita Sangli.
Thank you. I just have one general question. Years of maximum pressure has failed to discourage North Korea from aggressively developing its nuclear weapons, and military solutions are also unrealistic. So do you think a formal recognition of North Korea and its reintegration into the global non-proliferation system can still change Pyongyang's behavior? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we take next, please, from the IISS, Alexander Bolfras.
Thank you. My question is for the entire panel. We heard about the historical role of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence as a tool of proliferation, and I wonder how credible the American nuclear umbrella looks from your capitals in the era of American tough love. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we take from China, Jin Lu.
Thank you, Dr. Gingerik. My question goes to Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. As an ally of the United States, what changes do you envision in the Trump administration's non-proliferation policy? And what's your expectation of the future of AUKUS? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I please ask from the Philippines and the Young Leaders Group, Janelle John Domingo.
Thank you very much. My question is for the Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. The region has been seeing the rapid and opaque expansion of nuclear arsenals and ballistic missile capability, particularly by an NPT-recognized nuclear weapon states. Now, China remains the only ballistic missile-capable state in the region that refuses to join the Hague Code of Conduct. And there are many good reasons why the Chinese have refused, which include its non-binding nature and its exclusion of cruise missiles. Do you think these are fair, and would you be willing to revisit the Hague Code of Conduct to accommodate China's concerns? Thank you.
Thank you very much. From the United Kingdom, John Chipman. John.
Thank you very much. I noted Richard's remarks that the arms control regime has collapsed, resulting in no regulation of the nuclear balance of power. It's called for more attention be given to cyber and AI. Rubin saying the same thing about the importance of responsible use of AI in military affairs. Of course, during the Cold War, there was a very complex accounting system, as Bastian suggested, for measuring the nuclear balance of power. Accountable warheads, delivery vehicles. If, for example, a missile was tested with 10 warheads, every deployed missile was counted as having 10 warheads, regardless of its actual load. So 90% of the time in arms control negotiation was spent on the units of account and how to calculate balances. What on earth will be the units of account and the regulatory system around measuring AI, cyber, and the like? Are we anywhere near the beginning of calculating how to count these things and therefore how to assess appropriate balances?
Thank you very much, John. I'll take two more from the Young Leaders Group, and then I'll return to the panel. Richard, I'm just going to put you on notice since you have, I think, the largest share of direct questions. I'll ask you to go first in a minute. But can I please have from Indonesia, Gatra Priyandita?
Thank you so much, Dr. Giegerich, and thank you, Excellencies, for your remarks. My question is primarily for Deputy Prime Minister Marles and Minister Rekkelmans, and it's about the proliferation of another dual-use technology, which is spyware, cyber-intrusive capabilities, and other kinds of offensive cyber capabilities. While these products are obviously very important for national security and law enforcement, we have seen them being misused for repressive reasons by both state actors as well as non-state actors. Regulation industry remains very light. There are international arrangements like the Palm Mall process to address them. For the most part, I think a lot of states, including those that host a lot of spyware companies, have not been taking this issue as seriously. How do your governments plan to ensure transparency and accountability in the deployment of these tools internationally? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last one in this round from Japan and the Young Leaders Group, Riho Aizawa.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Questions about Australia. How does Australia plan to cooperate in strengthening U.S. nuclear deterrence further in this region? And what actions or commitments from the United States would make Australia feel that extended nuclear deterrence is credibly provided?
Thank you very much. So we'll take those. That's a fair bunch. Richard, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Ruben Breckelmans, and then Mr. President, we'll conclude this round of responses with you, and then we'll get a few more comments in. Richard, do you want to start addressing these?
I'm on. There you go. So I'll try to do these as best I can. Perhaps to start with North Korea and formal recognition, I guess, into the nuclear state, as a nuclear state. I mean, I think all of that is a concern. I fundamentally feel that what we have seen with North Korea and its pursuit of nuclear technology represents one of the single most destabilizing actions in terms of the whole proliferation regime. If there is ultimately a recognition that in any respect that is valid, then what that will lead to, I think, as President Macron said last night in respect of Iran, is a very dangerous circumstance indeed. A couple of questions went to the US nuclear deterrence and the credibility of that. As I said in my opening remarks, that the US nuclear extended deterrence is actually a contributor to global stability within the framework of what we have under the NPT, and it remains an important feature of maintaining stability in the world, and that is certainly how we see it. John, you raised the question about and it was a really good question, and there was also one from Indonesia. You raised a question in relation to AI, and there was also a really good question in relation to offensive cyber, both of which kind of had the same theme of, when we look back at the period of nuclear arms control, accounting was a key part of it. So how does that work in cyber? How does that work in AI? Excellent questions. And in a way, I think you put it in the best. Are we even at the beginning of that? I think we are at the beginning of it. I mean, it is a really good question. Obviously, I don't have all the answers. But I think it's important that we not look at that as being seen to be an insurmountable challenge and a path down which there is no point in walking. The former British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak hosted a conference in actually Bletchley Park I'm going to say it was around the end of 2023, which was really looking at the beginnings of how you might seek to provide global norms in respect of the development of AI. And I think there were ideas in relation to all of that which do give us the beginnings of how you could establish a framework to shape the way in which AI is used and ultimately ensure that there are guardrails in terms of how it is used in a military context. And I think that is a good example of the beginnings of an effort to try and walk down that path. And again, I think in respect of spyware and offensive cyber, there are opportunities there to do that as well. Finally, I think there was from China a question in relation to the future of AUKUS. I mean, AUKUS in respect of its providing Australia with an ability to acquire a nuclear-powered submarine capability is continuing to proceed and continuing to proceed on course. And both, the United Kingdom, the United States and Australia all share the vision and the belief that Australia having a capable long-range submarine capability is important in terms of contributing to the balance, the stability of the Indo-Pacific, ultimately the collective security of the region in which we all live. I think in the context of the discussion that we're having today, again, as I said in my opening remarks, in walking down that path as a non-nuclear arms country, we are doing so with the highest safeguard standards and in cooperation with the IAEA to ensure that all that we do in relation to AUKUS is compliant with our obligations under the NPT. And beyond that, we've made clear that the commitments we make, not only through the NPT but through the Treaty of Rarotonga, which is around having a nuclear arms-free Pacific, and we are a signatory to that we will maintain our obligations in respect of that in our pursuit of a long-range submarine capability.
Thank you very much. Ruben Breckermans, if I can turn to you, and there are a couple of things in there for you to address as well. There's that transparency and accountability question. There's also the American nuclear umbrella question in there for you. I don't know whether you want to offer thoughts also on the DPRK question. Can that behavior be influenced if we were to change the approach? And maybe you'll take those and anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, sure. So to start with the last one, I don't think that it would change DPRK's behavior. I think if you look over the past years and decades, DPRK had many opportunities to take a more constructive stance towards the rest of the world, and they consistently decided to not do that. And I think if we change our policies toward DPRK now, I think we would reward bad behavior, given that they have been supporting Russia over the last couple of years and violated all UN sanctions. So I think it would erode those regulations, and it would erode the international rule of law if we at this time reward North Korea for bad behavior. Regarding the nuclear umbrella, so we as the Netherlands, we have F-35s, and we were the first European country to make the F-35s nuclear capable. So we play, in this respect, we play a role in the nuclear deterrence. We work together very closely, of course, with the United States on this. And I think what is important in the message of the United States toward us is that they, of course, they encourage and they push us to take more responsibility for our own security. But at the same time, they consistently say that NATO is more relevant than ever because NATO is a force multiplier for the United States in the world, and that their commitment to Article 5 is also as strong as ever. I think those two fundamental pillars are key. And I think for the European audience here in this room, it was very important this morning to have the Secretary of Defense recognize that and acknowledge that European countries are stepping up. And to me, it was maybe the first time, or one of the first times, that I heard the US administration acknowledge this so explicitly. And I think it is also a reflection of the fact that we are indeed stepping up in Europe, as we should do, because we need to take more responsibility for our own security. There was a question on the Hague Code of Conduct. I can only say, you know, given such a beautiful name, it's a great code of conduct. No, I think the underlying question is, of course, it's not perfect, but I think it's better to comply with something that's not perfect than to not comply at all. So there is something on ballistic missiles there, maybe not on cruise missiles, but it's better to comply with that code of conduct, even though it's not perfect. I think the questions regarding cyber and AI were excellent, and also given the questions related on spyware. So I think it starts in this domain, which is evolving so quickly. It starts with getting to a common language and to a shared understanding. And that's why we as the Netherlands took the initiative in organizing the RE-AIM conference, so responsible use of AI, to have this global conversation and to get to a common understanding. That happened. And now we are turning the discussion into, or we're having a discussion about what type of norms and type of rules can we all accept. We even had a UN resolution which was passed with a big majority, and also with a group of countries that you would not necessarily define as partners or allies. So I think it's good that we are making progress on getting to not only agreed language, but also to norms that we accept. Of course, I'm not naive. I don't think that everyone will immediately behave according to those rules, but at least if you see a violation of that rules, you have something that you can hold each other accountable, and that you can also use as a start of a conversation or as a critical dialogue. Of course, the next step would be, can you then also measure violations, and can you have an independent body then identify that, and then can that lead to consequences? We are not there yet, and it's probably even much more complicated than with nuclear weapons, because you cannot physically detect it so easily, and you cannot so easily identify those violations. But at least we are making progress, and I think it's very important that we keep working on this. We had a RE-AIM summit in Seoul in the fall. Next edition will be in Spain, and I would encourage as many countries as possible to also participate in this, and to make sure that we make further progress on these international norms, also in these new domains that are evolving so quickly.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, may I turn to you to offer a few thoughts perhaps on these overarching questions of how do you get to mechanisms if the accounting of old is perhaps no longer the right way, and we need to step into behavioral or an understanding of the behavioral norms that should apply around proliferation and arms control. What are your thoughts on these questions? And of course, if you like to add anything on the North Korea question as well.
Well, as I mentioned in my remarks, countries arm themselves as they see the perception of they see their neighbors, they trust or not, or they watch events elsewhere. Remember, yes, the defense minister of the Netherlands mentioned about how Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And it was in the hope, in the expectation that in the post-Soviet era, there will be a much more peaceful environment, and there will be no need for nuclear weapons. South Africa, under Mandela, relinquished nuclear weapons. And so did Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, and it was celebrated, it was recognized. But then look at what happened to Gaddafi. Regime change. And of course, North Korea watched all of this. And Iran negotiated with four powers for over 10 years under President Barack Obama. And then the nuclear deal was reneged. And they follow in the last years of different activities. So all of this, you have to understand that it means it destroys confidence, increase fear. So how to get about this? There has to be dialogue at the highest level between the President of the United States and President Xi Jinping. Because if the perception, if you convince yourself again and again that China is a threat, and China is not only a rival. Yes, China is a rival, but not necessarily a threat. Maybe threat to your economic superiority. Maybe inevitably China might catch up and become the number one economic power. Well, so be it. It might change again. And years ago, and many generations ago, India was the number one economic power in the world, until the British came in and then ripped off India, and India became one of the poorest. Well, if you listen to Shashi Tharoor, whom I listen almost every day, and but this changed, because it is so important for peace, security in Asia, in the world, and so important for addressing issues of poverty, of climate change, that the powers that be talk to each other all the time. When you don't talk, you start getting suspicious, you read, you hear information, so mechanisms of prevention are because. And let me tell you, I know these things from personal observation and experience. Well, don't ignore the Russian population living along the Ukraine border with Russia after the end of the war, after the Cold War. Also, don't forget right now, the Serbians who live in an enclave in Kosovo. And in my country, we have 4 religions, majority Catholics, but we have 0 religious tension. We have a multi-party system. We have 0 political violence. We had a past conflict, and yet 0 hatred, 0 anger. Because the leadership tried to lead the people to a new chapter in our history, reconcile. Today we are a member of ASEAN, already accepted, because Indonesia changed. President Prabowo was here 2 years ago, and I was here listening to him. He praised our relationship, Timor and Indonesia. And so only through reaching out, understanding the other side, that you can prevent conflicts. Yesterday, President Macron spoke here. He said about double standards undermine our credibility. Well, we talk about Ukraine, the suffering of the Ukrainians, impose sanctions, and then what happened in Gaza? So we lose credibility. The world loses credibility. And let me tell you, I'm the one who nominated the European Union for the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Committee in Oslo was totally surprised. Why would I nominate the European Union? So I have I have a great admiration and support, and I want to see an Europe that is prosperous, that is stable, that can play a role as bridge. As I hope that ASEAN evolve into a bridge builder in the region and doesn't fall into the trap of force to side with one side or another in this geopolitical rivalry.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We have time for another round of interventions from the audience. And first, I'd like to call on Raksme Him from Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the floor. My name is Him Rasmay from the Cambodian Center for Regional Study. I would like to direct my question to the Minister of Defense of Netherlands and Minister of Defense of Australia. Minister recommend mentioned about the global security architecture post-Cold War, which saw proliferation of treaties, international law, and liberal value and norm that shape the global order that we are living in today. And Deputy Prime Minister Mal also specifically highlighted the importance of balance of power and risk of imbalance of power, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons. My question to the two different ministers is that now that with the war in Europe and tension and flashpoint in the Indo-Pacific, what went wrong in the past 30 years that contribute to the conflict and tension today? And in your view, what were the key lessons learned from the past 30 years that Europe and Indo-Pacific need to learn to stabilize regional and global order moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from Malaysia, Angeline Tan.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is for all of the speakers. In managing proliferation risks, there is increasingly a preference for minilateral and bilateral approaches. And although this may be more efficient, it often excludes the interests and concerns of smaller countries who are often left at the periphery of major power competition. My question is, what are the prospects of multilateralism today? And are there any specific mechanisms that we should be focusing on?
Thank you very much. And from Vietnam, Kang Phu.
Hi, thank you, Chair. I'm Kang Wu, I'm a researcher at Boston College. So I have a question about the danger of arms control. There are a lot of concern around the Asia Pacific right now that if you sign an arms control or the US signed an arms control with China or with Russia, that can be seen as a measure of abandonment of allies. Basically that China or Russia, they can exploit those arms control to limit the ability of the US to defend its allies. And obviously that a lot of these Asian allies and partners of the US, they are really worried about that. So how do you recommend the US or other countries in the region reassure the allies that arms control is a good thing and it's not just simply a measure to withdraw from the region? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And from Indonesia, Jasmine Afina.
Thank you very much. I'm encouraged by the mention of the Responsible AI in the Military Domain Summit, or AIM Summit. I work for the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, so UNIDIR, and we've been fervent supporters, including through the organizations of regional consultations to support RE-AIM just last week for Asia Pacific in Seoul. So I have two-part question. So first is, considering that AI is bringing forth a lot of questions around proliferations due to its general purpose nature and dual-use nature as mentioned earlier, but also intangible, and its risk into proliferating into the hands of non-state armed groups, what will be the role of industries in preventing the proliferation of such technologies? Because I know that they are taking part of the RE-AIM Summit, for example, but beyond that, could we perhaps look into voluntary commitments by industries and non-state stakeholders? And then second is, with regards to the proliferation of these technologies and non-proliferation efforts, we also must take into account the fact that these technologies also bring a lot of opportunities for smaller countries. And so how can we strike the right balance between leveraging the opportunities these technologies may offer for international peace and security for smaller countries, while at the same time preventing proliferation into non-state armed groups? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we'll have next Morgan Michaels, please. Morgan.
Thank you, Bastian. My question is for President Horta. Although it's the biggest ongoing crisis in the region, the war in Myanmar remains relatively low on the list of global priorities, perhaps because the violence is confined to the country itself, at least for now. But as we've seen, Myanmar has emerged as the epicenter of a billion-dollar scam industry, as well as other transnational threats like human trafficking and narcotics that are afflicting the region. My question is, how do we prevent global leaders from ignoring certain security issues at their own peril? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll have from Thailand, Surachani Srijai.
Thank you, Chair. My question is also to President Ramaphosa. So, as a Nobel Peace Laureate, what's your opinion about the concept of deterrence through enhancing military capabilities? Because ultimately that could also mean armed proliferations. Is it paradoxical to the concept of peace at all, especially when we're seeing an erosion in rule-based world order? Thank you.
Thank you. And one more in this round from India and the IISS, Vipatrap Vikram Singh. Vipatrap, over to you.
Thank you, Bastian. To the whole panel, we're seeing a generational shift in our societal relationship with technology, information and security, from AI-generated content, cyber-enabled information operations, and disinformation campaigns. Given the role that perception plays in shaping our understanding of threats and how we respond to them, I'm curious to understand how your countries are preparing to manage such a contentious information environment, and whether there are any safeguards that you are looking to implement that might help your governments and militaries better manage such an environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's turn to these questions. So, President, I'm going to turn to you first, perhaps to answer the 2 points that were put to you directly. There was the question using Myanmar as an example, which has become the epicenter of a particular kind of threat linked to the scam industry, human trafficking, narcotics. How do we make sure we don't overlook that challenge as leaders are focused on other global issues? And then the question addressed to you as a Nobel Peace Laureate: how do you think about the relationship between deterrence and peace? Between deterrence and peace. Are they paradoxical, was the question.
That is.
Deterrence, military deterrence.
Oh, deterrence. You know, again, in my conversation with Papa Francisco in Rome, in the context where I told him we failed in conflict prevention. And I said, in regard to Myanmar, there is a chance that we don't fail again, and that is to prevent the conflict from spiraling out of control. And we know the consequences of when a conflict spirals out of control. Spill over to the neighbors, armed groups become warlords, all kinds of organized crime mushroom spread. Of course, ASEAN has the central role in that. It has done its best through the special envoys of each chairmanship of the last 3 years. And I have always been a proponent for a dialogue without preconditions. Ideally, it would be ASEAN plus whatever country ASEAN chooses, whether China and the West and a combination of other countries, but with central role by ASEAN to promote a process beginning of dialogue without preconditions involving everyone, the Tatmadaw, the ethnic armies, the NUG, the National Unity Government. without precondition. Get under a tent and talk. Get everything out of your mind, out of your chest, and talk. Because it's highly unlikely that the war would end with one clear side winning, imposing a military solution, and then a new political dispensation. Highly unlikely. And the risk is that there will be the army, possible, would crumble because of leadership issues. And then maybe the ethnic nationalities, the other side, strong, politically speaking, and there are certain military capabilities they have, but not enough to control the territory. So you would have a situation of instability that affect the whole country. So ideally it would be someone with a great authority and persuasive skills to persuade everybody. It is time for all of you to sit down and talk. That's my response to. And unfortunately, there has been so little attention paid to Myanmar by the powers that be. Very little attention. And yet the human tragedy is colossal. For a long, long time, even before the coup 3 years ago. And then the issue of deterrence and peace. Yeah, I couldn't disagree with the concept of, yes, peace through deterrence. When you live in a region, in a world, where potential threats exist, one cannot be overly romantic and have to be realistic. But at the same time, as you create a credible deterrence, you engage in dialogue. That would be deterrence plus dialogue, plus mechanisms of consultations. That would be the best. So I see no contradiction in deterrence and peace.
Thank you very much. Minister Brekelmans, I'll turn to you next, but I think the issues that were addressed to you and to Richard Moss are broadly similar. So we'll take Ruben Brekelmans first, and then I'll turn to Minister Moss. So there's what do we take away from the failures to prevent conflict for the future? What are the prospects of multilateralism in managing proliferation risks? I mean, both of you touched upon this already, but maybe there's more to add there. Are you worried that there are circumstances under which arms control could undermine deterrence in a way that would affect you and that would worry you? And then there's also that issue of the role of industries in preventing AI proliferation, or how to leverage the opportunity with the risk, I suppose, is really the question. And then that ties into managing the information environment and disinformation environment. Mr. Brekelmans first, and then Richard Moss.
Thank you. All very good questions. What went wrong in the last 30 years? Of course, there's so much to say about it. But so for me, 15 years ago, I did a master's degree in global politics at the London School of Economics. And the main course of that master's degree was called From Empire to Globalization. And the idea was that the time of imperialism was over, that history was marked and characterized by empires rising and then getting to a peak and then breaking up and falling down. But that entire era was over, that we entered a new era of globalization in which interests would converge, in which ideas would converge, in which there would be a liberal world order from which we all would benefit. And because our economic relations would get stronger and because of digitization, because we get into more contact, that there would be no reason anymore to fight each other. Now, all those presumptions turned out to be simply untrue. Imperialism is not over, imperialism is back. We had very strong economic relations with Russia for many years, even after 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine or invaded Crimea, and there was already a war in the Donbass. We continued to keep trading with them. We continued to buy their gas. Russia was responsible also for MH17, a plane that was shot down. The Netherlands had the most casualties. And even after MH17, we tried to maintain good relations, or at least decent relations with Russia. We tried everything. We all remember just the days and weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, that there were many European leaders going to Russia, sit at a long table in order to discourage Putin to invade Ukraine. But in the end, he decided to do this. So all those assumptions we had about liberal world order and about how we can contain and avoid escalation, those turned out to be untrue, and we need to learn those lessons. So another lesson, we cut spending on our military because we thought that disarmament would lead to less conflict. Now, it was not perceived as a gesture by our adversaries, but it was perceived as a sign of weakness, which is now being exploited. So I think those are all lessons that we need to learn. We need to be more realistic, maybe, than we were in the past. But still, we need to uphold our values. That doesn't mean that we put all our values aside and that we do not strive for a liberal world order, that we strive for upholding international law and the same values. But I think it's important to do this with, on the one hand, a bit more realism, and on the other hand, make sure that we also have our hard power in order, and that we have also the military capabilities to enforce those values. When it comes to multilateralism, just very shortly, I think we should try to also uphold that as much as we can. It's in the interest of relatively smaller countries like the Netherlands to make sure that we have well-functioning multilateral organizations. The reality, though, is that it does not always work, and I think we will get to more and more ad hoc coalitions also in the military domain. So, for example, we are now working with the Coalition of the Willing to design a potential European military mission in Ukraine. It's because we would never get to a unanimous military planning within the EU on this. We have seen a few member states blocking a lot of our foreign policy and security policy decisions. So I think the reality is that we will get to more and more of those coalition of the willing type of structures, also because one election outcome can change the position of a country fundamentally. Take, for example, the United Kingdom. They stepped out of the EU. Now they're one of the leading countries when it comes to European security. And so just one election can make a huge difference. So that's also a reason, I think, why we'll get more of those coalition of the willing, in which sometimes countries join and then step out and join and step out. Arms control, I think the big question is, can we get to credible confidence-building measures? Because, as I said in the beginning, in Europe, we will probably not trust Russia for a long time. So if we will get to a phase of disarmament, maybe at some point, we will definitely need to have some credible confidence-building measures, because we will not believe them if they simply say that they will disarm. Finally, when it comes to AI in the military domain, I think it's very important, a very good point, to engage the industries and to engage companies. I do also see that as one of the major next steps that we need to take. So I think it's, as I said, it's good that we have gotten to common language and that we have norms that were accepted by a big majority in the United States General Assembly. And I think one of the next steps now is to make sure that we also get more and more industries and big companies on board. And of course, we will not get everyone on board, but if we have a few of the big players, I think that will send a very strong message, and also probably encourage others also to join as well. It's a very good point. We need to work on that.
Thank you very much. Richard, you have the last word.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with a very good question from IISS India around how we do manage restraint and controls in AI, or in nuclear technology, but in the context of social media, the internet, disinformation, and what I thought was a beautifully used phrase, which I'm going to borrow now and adopt, which is a contentious information environment. I think that sums things up greatly. When I look at my children, my teenagers, absorbing information from TikTok, and I look at what that information is, using ChatGPT to work out how they can answer particular questions and then engage in social media and then do their own homework. Ultimately, I have to say, I just have a profound sense of feeling both confused and old. But I'm very well aware that none of those are particularly constructive feelings in terms of moving forward. But I do genuinely think that the information environment in which people are growing up in today is genuinely one of the biggest challenges that we face. And it is in large measure very unregulated. And I think there is obviously great advantages associated with it, and it has produced great good, but there is also great harm that can come from it, and it is important to think about what is appropriate regulation in its context. I don't have all the answers, but one thing that we have done in Australia is to limit the use of social media for kids under the age of 16, which is to start the conversation about the fact that there does need to be some responsible or limits around how people engage in this environment, so that people at least are in a position to learn how to discern what information they ultimately absorb. And I think that is a foundational question in terms of how we move forward in relation to all of these questions, because as you rightly said, perception is very much at the heart of how a lot of these steps are taken. In respect of AI, I think a couple of really good points. It is absolutely right that as we establish global norms, we have to be thinking about industry and the private sector. This is not like the development of nuclear technology, which was essentially done by state actors in its early days. This is something which has industry very much at its heart, and so it needs to be part of how we conceive of constraints that are placed around the application of this technology. But you also made the point that there are a whole lot of benefits that come from AI. Of course there are. And in that sense, I think there is an equivalence with nuclear technology. I mean, you just look at nuclear medicine, for example. A whole lot of really good things have come for humanity from understanding that science. And really at the heart of these constraints and restraints is about ensuring that the science is ultimately developed in the favour of humanity and not against it. In relation to the question of multilateralism and minilateralism, I mean, a couple of things to say. I think minilateralism is fine. There are lots of minilaterals around which really do play an enormously significant role in providing for the stability and the security of the world. And they don't have to be exclusive in nature. I think it's about how minilaterals go about their business. Australia is not a member of ASEAN, but we are deeply engaged by ASEAN, and a coherent Southeast Asia under the banner of ASEAN is deeply in Australia's national interest. And so you will not see a bigger supporter of the idea of ASEAN centrality than Australia, even though we are not a member of that organisation. But it is an organisation that we engage with really significantly, and it is very central to how we see the world. And I think it is a model for how minilateralism can operate. Multilateralism clearly has a very significant role to play. I mean, those global norms and treaties which aspire at least to have universal membership are fundamental to underpinning a global rules-based order. And the NPT has that aspiration, and that is a perfect example. There was the question around how do we, how do we deal with arms reduction and not give rise to a sense that people are being abandoned? I think Ruben answered this perfectly. At the end of the day, this is a question of whether or not there is the trust around which enables arms reduction to occur. I mean, to be clear, all of our advocacy is about an American engagement, for example, in the Indo-Pacific. I spoke about that in my opening remarks. We want the US very much engaged in this region. US extended nuclear deterrence means that a country like Australia doesn't need to think about going down those paths. Any form of arms control can only happen if there is strategic trust which enables that to occur. And that leads to the final question, which was in fact the first, around what's gone wrong in the last 30 years. Jose talked about the fact that he thought it was fine to have deterrence coupled with dialogue. I like that, the way in which that is put. I was going to say we need balance, or what's gone wrong is a failure of balance and strategic transparency. I actually think those two things are pretty much the same. We need to have balance in the world, but there needs to be the dialogue and the openness in terms of why countries have military capability, which enables there to be a strategic transparency and reassurance around the having of those arms, and that is the basis upon which you will have peace and ultimately walk down a path of arms constraint.
Richard, thank you very much. That concludes our third plenary session. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister Brekelmans. Thank you so much for taking us through your thoughts on managing proliferation risks in the Asia-Pacific. We shall now break for lunch, and then the afternoon program continues here with the special address at 2:45. So let me invite you to thank our speakers.